So today I'm really excited about the topic that we're talking about. I have been waiting for Kathy to present about particularly the data in here for a very long time, and we are thrilled to have Nick and Jennifer as well from Diverse and Resilient. And they're going to talk to us about hooking up and serving LGBTQ clients.
And I believe there's a question about being muted. I think they're all already muted, correct?
Correct. Everyone should be muted. If you're not, the microphone in the bottom left-hand corner, but I don't think you should have the ability to unmute yourself. And thanks everybody for joining today. Usually it takes a little longer for folks to get on webinars, but I think that now we're all pretty used to it, that everybody's pretty ready to go right at the beginning. So Kathy, whenever you all want to get started, that's fine.
Okay, well, thank you. So the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen so we can get this PowerPoint up and running. We're going to ask you to, if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat box, and the CASA staff will be monitoring that, and we'll ask in natural breaks in the presentation. If you're asking a question that doesn't have anything to do with this, we'll probably save it until the end, okay? All right, so hi, I'm Kathy Flores. I'm the director of the Room to Be Safe Anti-Violence Program. We have two offices, one located in Appleton that serves northeast Wisconsin, and one located in Milwaukee that serves southeast Wisconsin. And let's see, we're going to be talking about LGBTQ hanging out and hooking up. We're going to be using some acronyms, and we're going to try to do a little bit of 101 before we get into the presentation, so that we can talk about those acronyms and why we use different acronyms. Sometimes you might hear Cutie BIPOC, and Jennifer's going to talk about that. And I'm going to introduce staff right now, the staff of Diverse and Resilient, who's going to be presenting, and then when they come on, you'll just know who they are. So I'm going to first start with Jennifer, because Jennifer is going to start after I finish. So Jennifer, if you just want to say a few words about yourself and what you do as an advocate, and then hand it over to Nick.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kathy. Super happy, excited to be here. My name is Jennifer Williams. Like Kathy said, I'm the advocate for Southeast Wisconsin. I'm located here in Milwaukee, and I use pronouns she and they.
All right.
Hello, everyone.
Nick.
Yes, my name is Nick Ross. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the Northeast Wisconsin advocate for the program, and we are based out of the Appleton office.
Thank you. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. All right, so I'm going to go into that first slide. I've got a very touchy mouse, so sometimes it likes to race forward. So we're with Diverse and Resilient, which Diverse and Resilient does statewide advocacy. Our direct services, I see a cat joining us. Our direct services are typically in Northeast Wisconsin and Southeast Wisconsin. We do some travel to programs who might need some technical support or assistance, training and things like that. But our mission at Diverse and Resilient is really to achieve health and equity and improve the safety and well-being of LGBTQ people in Wisconsin and communities in Wisconsin. We are working with Ubuntu Research and Evaluation now, so we are actually changing our mission at some point here because our work is really inclusive of challenging the systems of racism and anti-Black racism and Cutie BIPOC, which queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So we will be coming out again. We're going to come out again, but we're going to come out about our work that specifically is centered on people of color and Black and Indigenous and people of color. And I just want to say why we do that. The reason we do that is because we have known that systems have been predominantly set up to serve white people. As we saw with the Supreme Court cases, you know, white people were the folks who were the defendants, because I believe that, you know, the lawyers probably thought that was what the court wanted to see. At Diverse and Resilient, we want to start to change the narrative and change the movement, because a lot of the work that we do is centered on making sure we're removing oppression, including the oppression of anti-Black racism and other forms of racism. And I will assure you that by centering our programs on people of color, that does not leave white people out. We definitely serve white people, and especially in Northeast Wisconsin, the majority of the people that we serve in Northeast Wisconsin identify as white or white presenting. I'm Latinx and white presenting, so I like to just take that moment to talk about white privilege, and the white privilege that exists in anti-violence movements is also heterosexual privilege and sometimes gender privilege, because our programs are often very focused on the gender of female and the color of our victims, survivors that we work with being not Black, Indigenous, or POC. So we just want to assure you that as we do our work, white people never do get left behind, and we do not leave them behind in this work either. Our services are open for all, but just centering the voices of people of color right now and going forward is because they have been not centered, they've been decentered from our movement for too long, and they're often the folks in our community who are doing the most creative, innovative work around violence prevention, around addressing violence, and certainly around accountability. And so we're honored to be able to do that work in the state of Wisconsin. I do want to just give this warning that this presentation does contain information on sexual violence. I'm guessing you already know that, considering that you're here and working with the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. But we do not get into anything real graphic, but we do talk about sexual violence, and that if we just want to make sure that you take care of yourself. If that's if an area is getting a little bit too much to listen to, you can mute that part of it. We move on pretty quickly in this presentation. So we just want to open it up with that kind of centering and formatting. And also just know that you can ask questions. Again, we will set the tone that we will not respond to any like homophobic or racist or transphobic comments, but if you have questions that you're afraid to ask that you wouldn't ask elsewhere, we are very open to asking or answering questions here at Diverse and Resilient. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jennifer to do a little bit of 101 before we get started talking about hooking up and hanging out and what that means.
All right, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about first just beginning with some terms that we'll be using, and Kathy has kind of gestured to what those will be. And this is really just to make sure that we're all on the same page. We know that everyone is arriving with different levels of knowledge and different relationships to the queer trans community. And so this is just informative to let you know what terms we'll be using. And so first off, we want to just like talk about LGBTQ population. And that's a term that we've often heard, and you probably heard that referenced to talk about queer and trans people in the larger community. That's a term that we share some commonalities with in terms of sexuality and gender, but we also know that there are many other facets to people's identity that are important to them and influence how they experience the world and how it affects their daily life. And so terms such as QT/BIPOC, which is queer and trans people who are Black, Two-Spirit included, right, Indigenous, and people of color. That term is to be more inclusive and to really talk specifically about the different kinds of experiences and oppressions that people who are queer and trans, right, and hold different, who hold non-heterosexual, non-cis identities, have different experiences, right? But particularly for Black folks, for Indigenous folks, for people of color, those intersections do look pretty different. And so just to clarify, when we say LGBTQ, typically referring to like Black people, Indigenous people, POC, and white people who identify along the spectrum of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer. But QT/BIPOC is a specific term. And so this next term, LGBTQIA2S+, is just like the bigger, longer term of the LGBTQ+, and more inclusive as well, to include folks who are Two-Spirit, and that's referencing Indigenous people who hold more than, are not within the gender binary that we typically think of when we're talking about our Western conceptions of gender. And it also includes folks who are intersex, asexual, and many other identities and experiences along that. And so again, when you hear us we might use these words interchangeably, but LGBTQ plus or LGBTQIA2S plus, that those will just be like referencing the wider queer and trans community. And then also this next term, next little bullet here is AFAB/AMAB. And so as we're talking about gender, and as I'm talking about gender, I'll be talking about different aspects of gender. I'm talking about sexuality too, and sex, right? And we'll be sort of going through what those actually mean. And so again, you'll hear me use these terms because they're actually referring to something specific, right? And so I think we often use the terms woman, man to be just interchangeable in all of our lives, right? But we'll be talking about some specific things as we go further into the definitions. And also I wanted to mention, after this section about gender and sexuality and sexual orientation, there will be a pause, so feel free to like ask questions in the chat as well as we do that. One other thing that I'm going to mention before going forward is also like with all of this information that we're about to provide to you all and it's all for the purpose to better serve queer and trans people, to better serve Black, Indigenous, POC. But I also just want to take a moment to put this in the back of our brains as we go forward in this conversation. Just a couple of questions that I think we should all continuously interrogate in our work with survivors, in our work with Black, Indigenous, POC communities, in our work with queer and trans people, right? So as we talk, I really want us to think about in our own programs as well, why do we need this information, right? Like, why is it important to track people's gender, sexuality, to track, you know, some things that might be really invasive, and especially we know when we're working with survivors that there are just things that survivors don't want to share with us, right? And things that, you know, aren't really that integral to providing services for them. And so again, just keeping those questions in the back of your brain, right? Having more knowledge, information about our communities is so, so important to better serve them. But again, like just interrogate is, you know, in terms of your own intake processes and your own programs, is the information you ask from folks invasive? Is it integral to providing services for them? And is it relevant, right? So moving forward, let's talk about understanding sexual orientations. And so that is a person's physical, romantic, and or emotional attraction to others. And so I'll just review these basic terms, and I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with these terms already. And I wanted to say too that these terms will be just general descriptions. They're not defining. We know that everyone's gender can fluctuate, right? People's sexual orientation can look really different over time, all kinds of things, right? And so these orientations and identities are not necessarily indicative of a person's behavior or expression. But first, let's start out with lesbian, right? So a woman whose primary attraction is to other women. We've already mentioned the term queer. And so that's really an umbrella term. It also can refer to specific identity. Is a term that can be used to describe gender and sexual identities and claim as unique identity, or to describe, you know, the wider LGBTQ community. And gay, we know this term, people, typically men, whose primary attraction is to members of the same sex. Asexual, had mentioned this before, right? So that's a person who has none or low desire for sexual activity with others. And we have bisexual, a person whose attraction is to more than one sex or gender. And then there's straight, right? And so heterosexual, people whose primary attraction is to members of a different sex or gender, right? And so we often don't have to, folks who are heterosexual don't have to think about our sexuality as much, just because we already have scripts for it in our society. Like, our society is a heteronormative society, and what that means is that all of our institutions, the institution of marriage, churches, many like things that we interact with in our daily life are all pretty much centered around folks who are heterosexual, meaning that they're folks who identify within that gender binary, right? And folks who are attracted to people who are of the opposite sex that they are, right? You can go forward, Kathy. Thank you. And so next, just moving forward, and then also feel free to, I don't know if I'm going too fast, but feel free to stop me. Moving forward to understanding gender identity and expression. So gender identity is a person's internal, deeply held sense of their own gender. And gender expression gender as presented through one's name, pronouns, clothing, haircut, behavior, voice, or other characteristics. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But again, just like an overview. And again, these can all be seen as like umbrella terms too, especially transgender, right? Because we know just folks' identities look so different from individual to individual. And so transgender, a term for people whose gender identity and gender expression is different from those typically associated with their assigned sex at birth, right? And so that's again referencing folks who might be AFAB, right? The term that I mentioned before, they might have been assigned female at birth, but their gender identity might not even align with that at all, right? And so the next term is gender fluid, when a person's gender identity and expression varies within or beyond the gender binary. It includes non-binary and gender non-conforming people. Talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then again, cisgender, I mentioned this term already. Cisgender is a term for people whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with their assigned sex at birth, right? And so again, if there is someone who AMAP, they were assigned male at birth, right? And that aligns with their gender identity, right? So what that means is that they feel the most comfortable in masculine presenting clothes, right? They have complete, total well, maybe not total, because gender, right? But some alignment with what it means to be masculine and what it means to be a man within our society, right? And so that's what those terms mean. You can move forward, Kathy.
I'm going to apologize because my mouse apparently is very, very quick moving. So I'm, there we go. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So just going a little bit deeper into what gender, we're talking about gender, we're talking about sexual orientation, right? These are the sort of aspects of how we can think about those things in terms of behavior, right? So that's what we do, what we say, and how we act, right? And then in terms of expression, and so we've already kind of gestured to this before, and that's the external display of gender through a combination of dress, demeanor, social behavior, and other factors. And that's generally, like I've already mentioned too, measured on a scale of masculinity and femininity. And then also orientation, right? So we've talked about sexual orientation, and that refers to the attractions, fantasies, or behaviors that someone might have, and then their identity. And again, that person's internal, deeply held sense of their own self. And identity itself is not something that can be ascribed from externally, right? So identity is not what someone else ascribes. And I also just want to say too that with identity, periods of identity development tend to be really anxiety producing, right? And so for people who are cisgender, we talk about cis folks a little bit differently, right? Because those are folks who likely have never had to question or think twice about their gender, right? And so they've also not had to think twice, likely, right, about how they behave, right, how they express themselves. They have, and especially for folks who are heterosexual and cis too, right, you probably haven't had to think about, you know, am I really attracted to this person, right? Or had to think about your attractions to other people, right, who hold different gender identities too, right? And so we make the kind of reference to cis people because there is a lot of privilege in not having to think about any of those aspects of your identity. And like I said, when you don't have that privilege and you don't have the same sort of like scripts and knowledge and community and access and acceptance in society, when you don't find yourself aligned on any kind of cis heterosexual normative gender and sexuality, then that it's hard. It's really hard, right? Again, it produces a lot of anxiety. It's a mode that people can experience oppression through, right? And that can influence all of their, like I said, access to all kinds of things. And we'll talk more about that going forward too. And so again, just going along this, diving a little bit deeper, we've talked about gender identity as a person's internal, deeply held sense of their own gender, right? And there are, within that, there's another aspect to it, and we know that when we're talking about genders that are non-cis, right? And sometimes not. That people may use different pronouns, right? And so as we introduce ourselves with our pronouns, you may have noticed that we all didn't introduce ourselves with the traditional she, her, or he, him, right? And so just to go a little bit into pronouns is a whole other conversation, but pronouns are used to refer to someone when you are not using their name, right? So we already know how that works. When trans folks move through their transition in life, they often change their pronouns in order to affirm their identity, right? And so that's just an example of how pronouns can change, of how we're not always, we can't always expect or assume what someone's pronouns are. It's also just a reminder, pronouns are something that we share, that we offer, right? Like it's respectful if you don't know how to refer to someone to ask their pronouns, right? But if someone, it's not our business, it's not our job to ask people why they have pronouns that they do, but to really just hear them and affirm what we're told, right? Because when people tell us their truth, that's what it is, right? And then again, so gender expression, gender as presented through one's name, pronouns, clothing, haircut, behavior, voice, or other characteristics. You can keep going. Great, and then going a bit more into understanding the term transgender, understanding really what that means, and I mentioned that bit before. And I'll use transgender, trans person pretty interchangeably. You might also hear me say people of trans experience, because it's a pretty much an umbrella term, like I had mentioned, to refer to folks of all different identities who might find themselves somewhere aligned within transgender or trans experience, something along that. Again, a term for people whose gender identity and gender expression is different from those typically associated with their assigned sex at birth. And then moving to gender non-conforming, right? So so folks within the trans, folks who are trans, right? Folks who might identify under that umbrella term or feel that they are trans experience. Sometimes those folks also, or this is like tangential to folks who are transgender, might identify as gender nonconforming, and that refers to people who do not follow other people's ideas or stereotypes about how they should look or act based on the female or male sex that they were assigned at birth, right? And so it's also including the term we mentioned before, gender fluid folks too, right? And including, I say, but also like different experiences too, right? So gender nonconforming and gender fluid identifying people, usually they can't relate to themselves within the binary of the two cisgenders, woman or man, that we have prescribed to us in our society. And they may locate themselves as being both, or they may locate themselves as that changing over time, right? That's what gender fluid means, right? It can, and it's incredibly individual specific as well. And they may feel as if they're neither, or as if like their gender is just not even knowable within any kind of binary too. And I also want to mention that we're talking about all of this stuff, and I mentioned Western society a couple of times, and I say that specifically because it is specific, right? So our gender binary, as we know it, is pretty specific to Western countries and society. It's also something that's relatively recent. And so actually within the span of all human history and all human time, there's not really been similar conceptions of gender or conceptions, even conceptions of sex, right? And so across time, human history, many different cultures, groups, and communities have no conception of a gender binary, or they recognize, and this is something that's true today, right? They recognize a third gender or a fourth or multitudes of genders. And really that indicates to us that, as we know, right, that identity can be based in relationships, it can be based within roles in community and spiritual connections, etc., right? And of course, it's really culturally specific in the same way that pronouns are also culturally specific, individual specific, but it really ranges, right? Can be really different than our typical Western conception of gender. And everywhere in the world, societies with thriving cultures have recognized, revered, and integrated more than two genders. So that's a note. And it's also important to know, especially as we're talking about trans people and the oppression and violence that they experience, and additionally, you know, gender fluid and gender nonconforming people too, because it's not new. Like, trans people have always been around, you know, but what is new is this constriction that we have based on our society, right? And so we can understand that some tensions and violence would arise. All right, and so again, just referencing the terms that I used before: QT, BIPOC, queer and transgender, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and cisgender, a term for people whose gender identity and gender expression aligns with what's typically associated with their assigned sex at birth. And I'm sure you all are like very knowledgeable at this point about these terms, like you've learned it all. All right. And then a couple of other things about gender, you know, just diving even deeper into this conversation. Gender is something, again, that's really individual specific. You know, gender is not something that we can ever fully know about a person, you know, and we shouldn't seek to know. It's important to remember that, especially within our work, and that we shouldn't even like try to figure out anyone's identity, especially not by just looking at them. And like I said, when someone tells you, these are my pronouns, this is my gender, if they've given you that information, that's what it is. And I also want to say that we have been taught to rely on stereotypes to help us identify if someone is part of the LGBTQ community, right? And stereotypes are something that we all know exist across our society in different aspects, right? But it's never really helpful to us, you know, ever. And it's actually really harmful to assume or to treat someone a certain way just because of the way that you are perceiving them, right? That's, in other words, called oppression. So, well, I just want to say too that because gender is really specific to an individual, we might think as well that like people need to present in certain ways, you know, in order to be called by pronouns that they are saying that they use, right, or deserving of those pronouns or whatever it is, or passing is a whole other conversation. But again, just the things that we might expect from someone if they've identified themselves as, you know, trans, or if they've identified themselves as gender nonconforming, whatever it is. But truthfully, there's a lot of different conditions in our society that affect how we're able to present ourselves, express ourselves, and live, right? And so that's true for pretty much everyone in society, cisgender, heterosexual, to like trans and gender nonconforming folks as well. There's financial resources and privilege that often trans and gender nonconforming folks don't have access to, right? But I'm not saying that as like a generalizing statement, right? But we just know that that's true in our society. And so I'm talking about how the medical access that we might need, the access to those financial resources to present as a way that we want to in our clothing, right, our dress, and all kinds of things, right? And so I also want to say that the folks who have trans experience or who are gender nonconforming or somewhere along that gender spectrum, their experiences don't all look the same, right? So some people might opt to change their bodies through surgery to align with their expression and desired presentation. Some people who are trans do not desire surgery. Surgery is a very intimate and individual choice that someone makes to affirm their gender. It's also something that is really expensive, and trans people who desire some form of surgery, they do face significant economic barriers if they don't have access to, like I mentioned, that adequate healthcare and are unable to afford it, right? It's important to understand that every trans person won't look like the post-operation celebrities that we're pretty familiar with in media, and that are typically held up as the voices of the trans community, right? And so we're talking about, you already know who I'm gonna say, Janet Mock, we're talking about Caitlyn Jenner, especially, like those people, like in addition to, well, Janet Mock especially, in addition to the incredible work that she has done for the trans community, right, as a Black trans woman, she's also rich, right? She's also like someone who financially was able to affirm her gender identity in all the ways that she, well, I can't speak for her experience fully, right? But all the ways that she might have wanted, right? And that's true for Caitlyn Jenner too, in addition to Caitlyn's white privilege, right? And I'm speaking about those people because they're typically in the forefront of our minds when we're talking about trans women, right? And they're typically people who are celebrated, some for valid work, some for not. And truly, I just want to get across that, like, especially as we work with, across anti-violence programs, right, across, working with survivors, we know that people are coming in at all kinds of vulnerable moments in their lives, right? And this will be something I'll talk about a little bit later as well. We also know that, like, especially for queer and trans folks, they often don't just have one singular experience of violence, right? They often have not just had one singular, that moment that they're coming into your shelter or that moment that, like, they call your hotline, right? That's not, most likely, that's not the only experience they've had of oppression or not having access to things that they need, right? Or not feeling safe. And so that's just a reminder, right, that people can be presenting in any type of way when they come into your doors or when you see them, right? But that doesn't ever invalidate their gender identity, expression, or their experience. Thank you. And then, so this is an awesome little guide, and this is coming to the end of my bit, and feel free to ask questions at this point too. Again, this is a really great illustration of identity, gender identity, orientation, gender expression, and that biology bit that I've kind of gestured to as well. And feel free to read that and go through that. And if you have any questions on gender, gender identity, expression, orientation, or anything else, I think we're going to take a moment right now to answer some.
Yeah, I would turn it to Megan or Peter. Are there any questions? I don't see anything in the Q&A, but I can no longer see the chat box.
I'm not seeing anything come in through the chat. I do want to throw out there, I love this identity guide. Particularly what I like about it is that it is a human and not a unicorn or something like that. Well, the gender unicorn is cute and wonderful. I really like using, like when we're talking about identities and qualities that humans have, I like that it's still a human.
Thank you.
I wanted to throw that out there.
Right.
Then I'm going to turn this over to Nick.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer, for everything that you were talking about. So I'm going to start just by kind of going through defining hooking up and how that works in our world with LGBTQ people. So essentially, hooking up is just romantic and or sexual encounters that exist outside of long-term committed relationship, and it can be like really, really varied. There doesn't necessarily have to be sex involved. It could be just like meeting up for a date, but generally hooking up also refers to like just meeting up to have a sexual encounter, and not having any expectations as far as like a committed relationship or pursuing the relationship further. Sometimes that does happen, but it's not necessarily always the case. So and hooking up is experienced by everyone in society, not just LGBTQ people. What you see in front of you are a list of some of the most popular apps, smartphone apps that people use to meet other folks to hook up. Grindr is definitely the most popular one by far. And this isn't the only avenue for people to hook up, especially on the internet. Like any apps like Tinder, any sort of dating website or app is also going to be used by people to hook up. So even people are on christianmingle.com. I bet some of those folks are also using that to hook up and not just find partners. So it's something that everybody in society does. The apps that you see in front of you are typically marketed towards gay and bi men, but many other folks of other identities use these apps. Trans folks use these apps to make connections. Sex workers use these apps to make connections, and all of that is okay. At Diverse and Resilient, we support people's decisions to explore their sexuality and engage in sexuality however they want, as long as it's safe. And so as an organization, we definitely say that, hey, if you are using these apps, that's great, and we're here to help you if you need to practice ways to use them more safely. So I also just wanted to point out a couple of things. Interesting thing, so like during the pandemic, which we're still in, but the UK did a study that said that 1 in 4 gay and bisexual men were hooking up through apps during lockdown in UK. So that just goes to show you that, even though we have these lockdowns in place, people are still connecting, people are still hooking up. And yeah, I think you can move on to the next slide. So hookup violence, also called pickup violence. Pickup would be kind of typically like outside of technology. So like at a bar, if you meet someone at a bar for a casual encounter, or at a park, or wherever it is that you might happen to meet someone in real life. So individuals who experience violence during a hookup are often reluctant to report because of the stigma around the sexual activity involved. And they could feel extra shame or a fear of reporting because they engaged in anonymous sex. And I think that goes back to the fact that we live in a society that is cis heteronormative and homophobic, and our society tells us that the only acceptable and valid form of sexual expression is an expression that exists within a committed relationship between a cis man and a cis woman. So when folks are having sexual encounters outside of that boundary, many can have an internalized response to that heteronormativity and homophobia by saying, okay, the sex that I'm interested in and the sex that I'm engaged in does not align with this cookie cutter mold that I've been told is the only correct way to express sexuality. So I feel shame and I feel that it's wrong. So that's not that shame that they're feeling is not the fault of the person experiencing it. It's the fault of the society that defines sexuality and sexual expression in this limited way. Also, survivors of hookup violence can fear being blamed or arrested depending on the situation, and may not report violence to the police or to community-based organizations. And that goes back to the a history of law enforcement's inability to appropriately assess relationship issue, like violence issues, when it occurs outside of the standard dynamic of a cis man and a cis woman. So, and also just for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and other LGBTQ folks in general, they often have a history of police that has left them afraid to seek police for help. Police are not a source of help for a lot of people in that way.
Can I just add on this too, that this sounds like something from the 1950s when we think about police targeting the LGBTQ community, but it is happening today. You know, we had to really shine some light on when Sheriff Clark was the sheriff in Milwaukee County, participating in enticement stings where officers were in the park enticing traditionally gay or trans men, and some of these men were older, some of these men weren't out, some of these men had extreme negative things happen in their life, including suicide, because they were arrested, and these cops actually went into the park and pretended to be a gay man, you know, or whatever their identity was, and hooking up with, you know, plan to hook up with this person. And when that person reciprocated the attention, they were arrested. So it is happening today. And I know even in our county, I just want to put it out there for any law enforcement listening, you know, do not come to LGBTQ orgs and orgs that work with people of color and ask us to help you in your stings with sex work, because it victimizes people. And we believe in the legalization of all sex work, and including the buying and the selling of it. So I just want to put that out there, because I know there are folks in the law enforcement industry who may be watching this presentation, and we just want to be very clear that when you go into parks and different places to do a sting and to arrest LGBTQ folks for public sex or something like that, you know, we are the advocates who are going to be working with them to help them you know, get out of there and to get, you know, to get safety. And it doesn't make them any more safe, because I can tell you that that doesn't stop somebody from being LGBTQ. It just now puts them in the system, which makes them less safe.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can move on to the next slide. To add to that, something interesting about a lot of these apps is that they're location based. So essentially you log on to Grindr, you fill out a profile that asks certain questions, and then you have pictures on there. And then the other profiles you see are organized by how close they are. And you can actually go to the next slide. So this technology that is, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, if you could back up one more.
Sorry.
Yes.
I also
Thank
just want to say we have a quick question. What does AVP stand for? Anti-violence programs.
So this technology that allows you to see people who are close to you has also been used by police departments for entrapment purposes. You can actually find ways to manipulate the technology to find the exact location of different people. So, you know, that's another aspect of that. And then related to that is just kind of a side note. If you're working with an LGBTQ survivor who has an ex-partner that is engaged in stalking, or, you know, even if the survivor hasn't said my ex-partner is stalking me, if they're having an issue with their ex-partner, you might want to ask about if they're on hookup apps, and suggest to see if they can look into their settings to kind of turn off the location, the geographical locating technology, so that you know, that can come up where ex-partners are looking on apps to try to find the person that they harmed, so that they can, you know, continue the abuse. So just want to throw that out there too as you're working with LGBTQ clients. And then the second point here is that many pickups happen without any incidents whatsoever, but violence can still occur. So this point is important, because we just want to really drive home the point that hooking up in and of itself isn't the issue. It's hooking up with somebody who could cause harm. So we celebrate people expressing their sexuality, and we really, you know, we are here to support folks who want to engage in hookups. Hooking up is not the issue, it's hooking up with someone who could cause harm. So, and yeah, you could move on to the next slide.
Sorry, we have another question about this. Kathy, will you explain the we that agree with the buying and selling of sex? That would be the Anti-Violence Program of Diverse and Resilient. We, as part of the National Coalition, call for the decriminalization of sex work. And why we do that is because we know that the survivors that we work with, is particularly involved in sex work, only get more harmed when they are involved in law enforcement, and the people that are buying sex, you know, we just believe that sex should be able to be exchanged for trade, for money, for whatever, between two consenting adults without violence. We do not support trafficking. That is a whole different issue. Sex trafficking is a whole different issue. So when I say we, I meant we as in who you're looking at here today, Nick, Kathy, and Jennifer, and the Anti-Violence Program of Diverse and Resilient, and many queer anti-violence programs, including the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, the Sex Worker Outreach Project, which is a national program. We have some board members from that program in Milwaukee as well, and we work with them on decriminalization.
Thank you, Kathy. So there are lots of different forms of violence that could occur during a hookup if it is going to be violent. There could be verbal harassment, physical assault, sexual violence, and robbery, and even murder. It's important to point this out because, you know, the robbery is definitely a big thing. So if you are robbed during a hookup, we say that still falls under the umbrella of sexual violence, because like the medium through which this robbery took place was through the sexual relationship, you know, of trying to set up the hookup. So it's just important to be aware that it's not just sexual violence that could occur during these things that need to be addressed with survivors. It could also be robbery, harassment, physical assault as well. So, and then just another reminder that, you know, hookups can occur in real life through technology, and, you know, basically everywhere. So yes, move on to the next slide. So for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we did a social media campaign about this topic. This was in kind of like the peak of the first pandemic shutdown that we were all experiencing. And we were hearing from survivors that there was an added layer of shame because they were choosing to hook up during the Safer at Home order, which basically was advising people to not go out and stay at home. So, you know, we don't want people to feel like they can't reach out to us for support because they weren't following the Safer at Home order. And we also understand that people need to maintain their relationships. Jennifer designed these two images, which are really awesome and really hit the point home. You know, we're not going to, as advocates, we're not going to judge you for breaking the Safer at Home order. We understand that you deserve to maintain relationships, and that for a lot of people, the Safer at Home order was very isolating, and that, you know, people have to make those decisions as far as like what's, you know, what their needs are in that moment. And so we accept that, and we are okay. You know, we just want to work on removing that barrier of shame. So in 2019 at Pridefest, we did a survey for LGBTQ respondents who were there. And the survey was about all forms of violence, but specifically about, for those who experienced hookup violence, 49% knew the person who hurt them in a hookup. And that could be, there are lots of reasons for that. It might be, you know, someone they met at a bar that they had known around town. The LGBTQ community is very small, so oftentimes it's hard not to know other folks in the community, even if you've never engaged in a sexual encounter with them. Also, sometimes if you've hooked up with someone once and you enjoyed the experience, you'll hook up with them again in the future. So 29% experienced sexual violence, 27% experienced verbal abuse, 26% experienced other physical violence, and 9% experienced theft or burglary. So yes, you can move on. And this is just messaging we wanted to get out to the LGBTQ and cutie BIPOC community. Basically that hooking up is fun and we support you, that it's a good idea to create a plan to help you stay safe when you are gonna be hooking up and using those apps, and that we as advocates are available to provide sex positive and confidential support, whether you've experienced violence during a hookup or you are going to hook up and want to strategize ways to stay safe. So if you could click the next one. And yeah, just another reaffirming that we are here for you and we provide that sex positive and confidential support. And really just acknowledging that we aren't here to tell survivors or, you know, the folks who reach out to us what to do with their life. We're just here to lift them up and to like make sure that they are aware of all the different options that are out there for them. So, and then here are some safety tips that we provided to people who are engaging in hookups. This can definitely, if you have technological limitations, for example. So for the first one, before you hook up, get real-time face pics, consider a video chat, or meet at a public place if you're comfortable and safe. If you're not able to do that because of technology, you know, there are still other ways that you can stay safe, which is, you know, you can let someone you trust know where you're going and give them details like address, name of the person, and time frame. And you can ask them to check in with you. So, you know, and I would say as an advocate, if you're working with someone in this situation, boundaries are very important, but if it's within your boundaries to be available to a client, to be that person to check in with, then, you know, I would say you could offer that. Of course, if it's outside of your boundaries because you're not going to be, you know, at work during that time or whatever, of course, those should be respected. But if you feel comfortable being that person to have to check in with, you could definitely offer that to them. Another tip is to pay attention to alcohol and substance use. This isn't to say that people shouldn't be using substances or shouldn't be drinking. It's just to acknowledge that as we are using substances, that can affect our awareness and judgment, and that it's important to, you know, just be aware of where we're at so that we are in as much control as we need to be of like what we need to do, if we need to keep ourselves safe, if we need to get out of a situation, that sort of thing. And then finally, ghosting is okay at any time for any reason to ensure your safety and well-being. And ghosting refers to just not responding to any messages anymore, just like leaving that person alone, like not engaging with that person anymore through a phone or the internet. I think that there is a lot of stigma around this idea of ghosting because, you know, I think too that for a lot of cutie BIPOC and LGBTQ people who have used technology and apps to reach out, the experience of being ghosted or being ignored is not a good experience. So then in turn, people feel like they should not do that to others, that it's like, it's breaking etiquette to ignore a person's message or leave them alone. And we're just saying, you know, no, if you feel like uncomfortable or unsafe in that situation and you no longer want to talk to that person, please feel free to ghost them. You know, that's okay, and you're doing what's best for you. And yes, that's it for me for now.
Okay, thank you. And we've got about 35 minutes to go, so we're going to go as quickly as we can with as much information as we can and leave room. We'll be answering questions as we go. I just want to add on the decriminalization of sex work. Part of why you're seeing this movement coming a lot from the LGBTQ community is because we see the impact of police violence disproportionately on sex workers who identify as Black and transgender. And we see the homicide rates for them going up as well. And part of that, and you know, I'm going to give credit to Amanda Schumacher, who I know is watching, you know, who has worked in HIV for a long time, and other, you know, the LGBTQ community as well. And you know, when we have a society that drives sex underground, we start to see what happens when things have to go underground. When they go underground, that is part of why we've, in the LGBTQ community, have had to create safety for LGBTQ sex in general. When you think about the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of shaming about sexual activity. And now, you know, we're living in a pandemic now. There's certain shaming, but there is no shaming like there was of gay men, gay and bi men, specifically in the 80s and 90s from our own government. And so sex sometimes got driven underground. That's when you saw in those days, you saw bathhouses and things like that. The more we drive things underground, the more people will get creative to how to be able to meet their sexual needs without involving the traditional forms that other people might be using. And so I just add that the more that we can remove in law enforcement from sexual activity, unless it's a sexual crime of, you know, sexual assault or murder or something like that, the better we can get at having LGBTQ people feel safe about their sexual activities and being open about that with other people. The reason I have this picture up here, this is my friend Drew, and many of you know the story. We often tell survivor stories in our work, and in this instance, we're not going to be telling a survivor story because Drew was taken from us as a victim of homicide in 2017. In March of 2017, Drew had gone out on his birthday. Drew was a victim, I should start out, Drew was a victim of a horrific hate crime in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where he had to have emergency brain surgery. The bones in his face were all broken. He was extremely traumatized by that. And I worked with him in 2011 as an advocate, and he ended up moving to Marinette. Marinette is not a real hopping place. I love Marinette, but it's not exactly a gay hopping place. So he wanted to move to what he thought might be a more progressive community, and he moved to Madison, Wisconsin. Unfortunately, after celebrating his birthday, a person who could not accept his own identity as being a gay man targeted him, followed him home, and then ended up ultimately taking his life on his birthday in what appeared to be a hookup. And so we lost Drew, who had become an LGBT advocate, and we lost this brilliant voice. And part of this is we just want people to feel secure. We know that people are going to bars and hooking up. We want to make sure that we talk with them if they get any kind of like gut feeling or anything like that, that something isn't right. That, you know, the more we can help safety plan with survivors, the safer we'll help keep them. When I think about the night of Drew going out, I actually saw him on Facebook dressed up and, you know, looking snazzy, and he was kind of sad that he was going out by himself. And as an advocate, you know, I didn't intervene in that moment and say, make sure you do all your safety stuff, because, you know, I'm often the broken record of doing that. And I was with him as well. And, you know, I think when I think about what happened with Drew, if we all, you know, it's the worst case scenario. But when we think of going back, that we would love to be able to talk to these individuals about safety. And so now what drives me in my work is making sure that, making sure that when I talk to a victim and get off the phone with them, that they understand as much as possible the safety planning that we have put in place. Whether they follow that or not is completely up to them, but we really do focus on safety planning. And and I also just want to say, even when you safety plan and do everything that you possibly can to stay safe, sometimes violence still happens, and we recognize and tell people that it's no fault of your own, even if you've done everything that you consider right, because violence, people who perpetrate violence, you know, do that for other reasons. So for power and control reasons. And so I just want to bring up Drew as a reminder that this happens in our community. This happens in Madison, Wisconsin, which, you know, is supposed to be seen as this LGBTQ progressive place. So it happened in rural Wisconsin when Drew was living in rural Wisconsin. And we work with people from all areas of Wisconsin who are experiencing hookup violence, and most of them do not want to report to a mainstream program. They don't want to report to police. They're just looking for support. And this is sad because we know that victim compensation can happen if they do report, and that's the only way that victim compensation can happen. So, you know, I would love to see that possibility change with the Department of Justice, that it doesn't have to be a reported police crime in order for a survivor to get victim compensation. But I'm not in charge of those laws and those rules, but that's just a little plug for that. And so just remember, Drew, as we're going through all of this, I hold him in my heart every time we talk about this topic, because this is what we're trying to prevent. And with that, I'm gonna, whoa, I'm sorry, my mouse is all over the place. There we go. And I'm gonna turn it back to Jennifer.
Thank you, Kathy. All right. Thank you for the story always. And remembering that as, you know, really important because in relation to talking about the violence that queer and trans people or LGBTQ community experiences. And so I want to move on to continuing that conversation about violence, particularly violence against trans women. And so as Kathy had mentioned, violence in the LGBTQ community, violence against trans women is deeply, deeply impacting us. And you may be aware of this, but these are just a couple of accounts of trans women. All of them were trans women of color. Most of the women listed here were Black. There is a really, really sad and scary reality for trans women of color right now in this country. They experience disproportionate rates of violence, right? And particularly Black trans women. When we're having conversations about violence, we can't have that conversation without talking about the violence that trans women experience. And these are names from just 2020 alone. And so far we've lost around 12 transgender non-conforming people just this year alone, right? So it is really scary to just be trying to live your life right now as a trans woman, right? This slide is also want to bring up that when we're talking about trans women who have experienced violence, when we're talking about trans women who might be involved in sex work, who might be doing who have been forced to, you know, survive in different ways than you know a typical person might because of the lack of access that they've had to employment, to education, and those are things that we know, like statistically, we know that trans women are routinely fired from their jobs based off of their gender identity, presentation, whatever it is, racism. We know that trans women are routinely refused access to shelters, to vital resources, because of that violence, right? And we also know that there are some really harmful myths and misconceptions about trans women too, and one of those is that abusers can say that trans women aren't being honest about their gender identity, and particularly talking about hooking up, right? So we're talking about when trans women experience violence over hookup sites or whatever it is in their lives. There are men who are looking to hook up with trans women, and trans women, those abusers, right? Those men who may be abusers, right? Will say harmful things about them in order to twist that narrative, right? And this is a narrative that really does permeate into how we service trans women, you know, the options of care that they have, right? And it's a particular narrative about trans women somehow tricking these men into hooking up with them, right? Which is just completely, entirely false, right? But that is suggested to how, you know, those narratives are harmful and do create, you know, conditions of violence for trans women. But the reality is that trans women don't have to trick men because we know that attraction just exists so differently for everyone, right? But a lot of men, and I'm talking about all kinds of men, right, are attracted to trans women, right? And that kind of myth is harmful because it dehumanizes it creates those conditions of violence where trans women aren't able to access care. And so there's folks on here folks such as Melissa Luciano Ruiz, who was murdered at the beginning of this year, Nina Pop, Monica Diamond, Lexi. And again, these are just a few of the people, of the trans women that we've lost just this year alone. And so we're really at this point of crisis for trans women and trans people. You can move to the next slide. And so additionally, when we're talking about the wider crisis, right, and we've already talked about this before, but like we also have to be talking about incarceration, detention, and the police. We have to be talking about what's going on right now at this current moment. So Tony McDade is another trans person, a trans man who was murdered on May 27th this year by Tallahassee police. Just to speak to some of the barriers that trans people experience in life and even in death, right? Like even in his memorials and in news reports following his death, he was consistently misgendered, right? And that completely does a disservice to his life, to his identity, to his personhood. But those are some of the things that happen when trans people experience violence. And the folks that we've lost to violence over the years, right, we often, like, those reports are never fully accurate, right, because of that misgendering, misreporting. And that also continues into when people are incarcerated, right? So we're talking about incarcerated populations too, folks. It's folks who particularly are trans or gender nonconforming can experience sexual harassment, discrimination, abuse, can routinely be denied access to hormones that they might need, access to other medical care, right? They might be in a really, really harmful, violent, misguided attempt to protect. And it's not protection at all, right? We know that. Protect, but really just to not deal with folks who are trans or gender nonconforming when they're incarcerated. They'll be put in solitary confinement, right? And we know how harmful solitary confinement is to psychologically, mentally, how harmful that is for people. And especially as we had, we had a whole campaign about, or for Sexual Assault Month, we had messaging to recognize how much people need to maintain relationships for their physical, emotional, mental well-being, right? It doesn't just go away when you're incarcerated, right? Like, it doesn't mean that people, when someone is incarcerated, it doesn't mean that they don't deserve to continue to be healthy and well and safe, right? As safe as you can be in the violent structure that is the carceral state, right? But those are just some of the human rights abuses that can happen when people are incarcerated. I'm also talking about folks who are in detention centers as well. So undocumented folks, immigrants who are being held in detention centers are similarly experiencing all kinds of human rights abuses, and that particularly affects transgender nonconforming people who are in detention centers. And so, as we've talked about, we also know this is another different conversation for Black people, right? In this very moment, they have an incredible uprising happening against police brutality, and when Black people face the highest rates of indiscriminate violence from the police, you can recognize how valid this response is, right? You can go to the next slide.
Now just let us know that we have 20 minutes left now, and we have a lot of slides. So we'll get the information in there and try not to go too fast.
Okay, yes. So continuing on, and I'm like just breeze through this because this is a conversation that I know and I hope that we're all having, and a conversation that we're all looking at on the news, every single day. This is a conversation that we as queer and trans people, as Black people, as, you know, allied communities, we are constantly having this conversation. We are constantly talking about violence and police. And as Nick had mentioned, especially for survivors, right? Policing and how the police respond to survivors, particularly Black survivors, particularly queer and trans survivors, the response is often violent, right? And the response is completely, well, mostly miseducated, right? Like it really isn't based in any kind of justice or isn't based in any kind of understanding of the different realities that we face as queer and trans people, as Black people, right? And so in this slide, these are on the right, you will see a picture of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And so that's the current moment that we're talking about how racism also exists within our own communities too, and that's something that we all have to continue to fight, right? But we also have to recognize too that like this fight that Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, that they really had galvanized, right, back in 2013, 2015. This fight is really also a centuries-long fight, and we know that, right? But as these women who are queer and also trans, right, obviously Black, have often been erased from that conversation about in the Black Lives Matter movement, right, and in the wider media too. We often don't know or recognize these spaces when we see them, right? We often don't know that they are the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think, the Black Lives Matter movement, like any movement, has room for growth, and we know that they are important responses, as I had mentioned, important, valid, critical responses that have really like captured across our nation, globally, have captured an experience and have captured a struggle and a fight that people have been fighting for a really, really long time. And so they're responding, right? And I also just want to say on the left side, there are some pictures of protests that have been happening in these past couple of weeks. But additionally, just wanting to say too that the experience of racism, experience of anti-Black racism within the conditions of white supremacy is real, right? So all of these responses, like I said, are responding, we see people responding from queer and trans communities, people responding from Black communities, people responding from undocumented, from brown, indigenous communities. This is something that like is resonating with everyone. And there's no community that exists outside of the conditions of globalized white supremacy, right? Meaning that really means is that the actual liberation, and I talk about liberation is like something, a big concept, right, and can look really different for each community, but is also the liberation is also like the struggle and the fight of what's happening right now. That actual liberation within queer and trans communities specifically is tantamount to that liberation with a liberation for Black communities, liberation for undocumented, brown, indigenous communities too, right? And so when we, within all of our different capacities and programs, right, when we provide care for survivors, for Black, queer, and trans people, it's all deeply connected. Like we have to do that work as part of liberation. And we also have a legacy of movements before us. Like I said, this isn't a struggle, this isn't a fight that's brand new. Like no one's just like, oh, it just happened. Hey, we got to respond, right? No, we have a legacy and ancestors who started Stonewall too, especially in our queer and trans communities, right? We know that like it's never like when someone might come through our doors or call a hotline, like I said, it's never their first experience of violence. Often when they're queer and trans and they're QT BIPOC, right? This is yes, this is also a conversation that we have to continue to interrogate within our own work, within ourselves, right? And because when we have this adversarial relationship with police, right, when we know that police are violent, have a history of being violent with queer and trans communities, with Black communities, we, within our programs, if we truly want to offer care to people, if those are the services that we're, trying to provide for people, we have to interrogate. If you have a relationship with police as a program, you have to think about how that impacts survivors, how that impacts Black people, how that impacts Brown, Indigenous, undocumented communities, right? Because that can be the single barrier, right, that stops someone from receiving services from you, right? And the whole point of all of our work, right, is to continuously lower barriers for people. So really, again, along with the questions that I asked way at the beginning too, interrogate for yourselves, are the police serving us? Are the police actually terrorizing the clients that we're working with? Is this stopping clients from calling the hotline? Is this stopping people from even walking into the door? And really reorient your goal to be care for people, right? Reorient your goal in an informed and intentional way to be care for queer and trans, LGBTQ, Black, Indigenous communities.
And I would just add here too that there is push in our movements in sexual and intimate partner violence to have police in our programs, in our buildings, to show up at survivors' houses with police by our side. We know there are going to be times that survivors want to work with police. Of our warm line calls, oddly enough, in our first year, of the 100 survivors that we worked with, 100% of them did not want to work with police because of past experiences. So if I show up at the house of a survivor and I have a police officer next to me, that now looks like I'm no longer safe because I look like I'm part of the system that is harming them. And so I just throw that out there as a caution to advocates who are trying, your intentions are good, you want to save lives, but when you're seen with police and that's who you are with, it separates that advocacy. And so we get to go to court. There's a constitutional right that well, it may not be a constitutional right. I should not talk like a lawyer. There is a right that survivors are allowed to have advocates in court. We're there with the advocate. We're not with law enforcement or the district attorney's office or anything. We are there to be victim advocates. That means sometimes we have to be advocates with those victims when police have done something wrong, when the charges aren't right, and the survivor wants like a hate crime enhancer or something like that. And if we're seeing buddy with them, that can diminish the relationship. So I just wanted to add that.
Can I add one more point too?
Yeah.
Just because we're talking about, this is a whole conversation about hookup violence and sexual violence as a whole. In a past presentation, and this is relevant, right? Because when people experience sexual violence, hookup violence, often the first thought or the first route of justice, right, is to report, like Kathy said. And we know that just survivors that we've worked with don't ever want to report or involve police at all. And so I had a question before about, have you ever worked with SANE nurses? That was the question. Has anyone ever wanted to work with the SANE nurse after they had been harmed sexually, right, or had experienced sexual violence? And the answer is no, right? And as you might have guessed, just an extension of that, because that experience of violence extends, right? It's not the first experience with medical professionals. It's not the first experience with people in any kind of system that that person has had with violence, right? That's
okay. And we have 12 minutes left, so this is a hard part to go quickly through. I'm thinking we're not going to get through the end slides, which are about making, how to make your programs more inclusive. So I just want to offer that these PowerPoint presentations will be sent out to everybody, but I'm going to try to go, this is not something you want to go quickly through, but there are barriers for LGBTQ survivors not even reporting and why they're not reporting. And we want to talk about that. They're not, they're not seen as seriously, or they have their experience minimized, because especially if it isn't sexual assault in a penetrative way or some other way that may look like it's more aggressive, sometimes those experiences are minimized, and they think that women can't rape other women, or that another man can't rape another man. So sometimes those are not even labeled as sexual assault. They're labeled as a domestic, which we know that can happen in domestic violence as well, but sexual assault and domestic violence should be the charges that happen there. Or having to explain how it happened in more detail than one would ask of an opposite sex assault. And we've heard this, we have some amazing SANE nurses, but we've had other providers that have asked questions like, well, how do you normally have sexual intercourse? And that is just a very invasive question. That has been asked to LGBT survivors because the provider is trying to educate them on how this person who may be gender nonconforming, how they have sex outside of an assault, and that just isn't anything that ever should get asked. Or having to educate when they reach out. This happens with us all the time. I've gone to a doctor and I've had to say, this is my identity. And then they go, well, what's that? And then I spend my 20 minutes in my doctor's office. I spend 5 minutes talking about my relationship, who I have sex with, why I can't get pregnant, all of these things. And it gets wearing because I actually am there for them to tell me what's wrong with me, not for me to kind of like have to educate. And then I get into this non-patient doctor relationship. So if you're seeking education, seek it out from the professionals that are around you like us, but not from the clients themselves. Or having their experiences sensationalized. In Appleton, we had 3 gay men who were homeless and they were living in a hotel together, and an assault happened. 2 men assaulted another man. The headline the next day was 2 gay men rape a man, and that was it. And I called the reporter and I said, I don't remember ever reading a headline where a heterosexual man rapes a woman. You never talk about what the identity of their sexual identity is when they're heterosexual. Why are you doing this when they're gay? And it was clear it was to sensationalize and get that, get people to read that article because it sounded sensational. And knowing that the victim was gay, that was not anything that we could have released at that time. This was a long time ago that eventually came out. But what ended up happening in that situation is it made it look like there are gay men just roving hotels looking for men to assault, straight men to assault. And it continues to perpetuate that myth and stereotype that gay men are out there looking to assault men just randomly. Or they're being mistaken as the perpetrator. Officers may not be trained or understand the differences in relationships, and they show up and they're used to like seeing male, female, and perhaps there's somebody who might be more butch or bigger and somebody who's smaller. They often think of the smaller person, the more feminine person, as the victim because that can't possibly be the perpetrator, when sometimes it is. So it's really important to do case history and all that. Otherwise they get blamed for the assault itself. Not being understood if it happened in a bar or hookup environment or a public environment. We've talked about that already. Being treated in a homophobic manner by police or a rape crisis counselor or others. I was on the phone with an advocate, I will just say, and when I said, okay, when you're going to call this person, they use they, them pronouns, this advocate laughed on the phone and kind of made a snide remark. And so like, I knew right there as an advocate, I feel for this survivor that they're working with, because if they laugh just at the pronouns of they, them, they're not prepared to be working with LGBTQ folks. And there is a real fear of being outed, even though we're living in the day and age that we're living. I'm going to say we had a huge historic victory with the Supreme Court yesterday that basically said those of us that you're looking at right now, and LGBTQ people in general, cannot be fired for being gay or trans or any other part of the identity. And my partner talked about having to be interviewed on the TV for that, and was actually really angry because what they wanted to say is, why the hell are we still talking about this in 2020? But we're still trying to get our basic dignity and basic rights. We still don't have healthcare rights that have been passed. We still don't have accommodations, and we don't have fair housing that is inclusive of all LGBTQ people. So we have to still fight for those basic rights. It sometimes does feel like we're in another century that we have to just go forward and beg for those rights. And so sometimes people aren't out because they don't have all the rights that they deserve. Other things is there are a few services available or advertised for people who are not cisgendered women. Most support groups are filled with cisgender women, and that can be a barrier as well. And then these are things that we know that happen with female survivors as well, women and just all survivors, but victims, especially in the LGBTQ community, have reported if they had a normal physical reaction. We know that bodies react in a certain way. And if their reaction was normal, often cops aren't believing them that, well, you had an erection, for example. Bodies respond to stimuli. We've talked to children about this who are survivors of sexual abuse. This is a very normal thing that happens. Or they use drugs or alcohol, or they consented to some acts, but were forced to do other acts. And then now they have to tell a police officer, well, I agreed to do this, but I didn't agree to do that. And we've heard officers dismiss it. Well, if you agreed to give oral sex, That must mean you agreed to have sex with this person. That doesn't mean they agreed to penetrative sex on any other part of their body. Or they've been in an area where men are picked up for anonymous sex and forced to, and they've been forced to have sex. This has happened with police officers too, who are on stings and actually have sex with LGBTQ people. Those LGBTQ people never report that, because when they've been sexually assaulted by a police officer, where do they go? They can't go to that police department. They come to us. Or they've had consensual sex with men at other times, and so they're seen as, LGBTQ, and therefore the officer may not understand those dynamics, and they're just kind of put in this category. Or common that we hear from survivors in general, that they may be too scared to resist, or they felt powerless. But especially in male survivors, we hear that I often, when I'm talking with them, they'll say, I should have been able to fight back. I work out every day. And there's some sense that if you're physically fit or strong, that you should be able to resist a sexual attack, when this feels like the most invasive thing happening to your body. And trauma teaches us that people go into fight or flight or freeze, right? Sometimes you go into freeze, and we have to educate survivors about that happens to all of us that are survivors. And non-binary or transgender youth, they're already living in a place or in a society that continually sees them as freaks and deserving of violence. It often happens from peers. They're constantly in schools name called, constantly stared at, having, others having force themselves upon the victim, experiencing physical attacks. They are more likely to be labeled as mentally ill, which creates other barriers, because they're being treated for a mental illness rather than their gender identity. And yes, we're still fighting conversion therapy laws in communities. Conversion therapy is still something from a religious standpoint that people are sending their children to state, to try to change their gender identity or change their sexual orientation. That doesn't happen. That cannot happen. It often ends in suicide. People can change behaviors, but they cannot change their identity through prayer or anything else like that. We have already gone through some hookup violence tips, so I'm not going to go through these, but is this, Nick? Actually, we're going to go through this. Let me just see where we're at. We really only have 3 minutes left. So I recognize that the time that we thought we had was much longer.
Well, and Kathy, as long as you all have time to, you're welcome to keep going. I don't need to jump off. And obviously attendees, if they need to, there will be a recording available. So
okay, perfect.
If you want to keep going, that's perfectly fine.
All right, then we will do that. Nick, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, and yeah, this is pretty much review, but this is more tips for advocates who are working with clients and want a safety plan around hookup violence. I just want to throw out there too, I wish there was another way to call something else to call safety planning, because it sounds very I don't know, wonky or something, but we already always are doing safety planning in our daily life all the time, whether we're getting ready for a job interview, going out for a date, etc. So just helping people understand that safety planning is something they're already doing all the time is just creative imagining and working through different scenarios. So tips for advocates, just remember that the risk is not in hooking up itself, but with someone who causes harm, and then be sensitive to the shame around that, and just affirm that it's perfectly fine to hook up and to seek out relationships in that way. And then also help identify safe people and places, like places to meet up, public places, etc. Help identify safer sex tips, tools, and resources. If you have a Vivint, which was formerly known as ARCW in your area, they can provide free condoms. Diverse and Resilient in Milwaukee does so as well. Just so that they have those resources available. And then just a note about the safer sex tips. Things have really evolved from back, 15 years ago when I was doing HIV prevention training as a teenager, where it was very heavily condoms, use condoms all the time, barriers, barriers, barriers. Now those are seen as one tool in a bigger toolbox of harm reduction and safer sex. So just be aware of that. And then also understand that reporting to law enforcement or medical may not be an option for all the reasons that Jennifer and Kathy have described. And then this, just to kind of change the tone a little bit, this was a sticker that we developed in and tattoo that we developed in collaboration with the Virginia Anti-Violence Project that we passed out during the 2019 Pridefest, just because it's a celebratory environment and we wanted to keep the messaging light and fun, but this still gets across the point that consent is extremely important in all things. And so that is connected to, you know, the more heavier things that we're talking about today. And then, yeah, so all the things that we offer include a warm line, which is described there. It's not a 24-hour hotline, but we will return calls or messages as soon as we're able. We can do safety planning. We do work with other programs to assist visitors, or excuse me, clients. So in whatever way that is needed. So if we are working with somebody in our program who suddenly needs shelter, or if a shelter program is working with a client that they have and needs additional support, we're happy to work with those programs in that way. We provide community resources, the full spectrum for whatever the need might be, anywhere from, you know, trying to find emergency shelter, helping with clothing, accessing food, mental health, transportation, all of that. We do our best to support clients in that way. And then referral, we refer to other programs like shelter programs if our client needs that, mental health providers, even, you know, physical health providers as well. And then this, that poster there, some of you might have these posters in your program office, but this just is our poster you might see around town, whatever town you're in, that just lets the community know about who we are and the services that we offer. And
you might recognize one of the models on the poster. That was Nick before we hired him in the early days of developing our brochures and posters. So I just want to talk a little bit about allyship. By the way, I hate the word ally, so I'm going to talk about it, but tell you that I hate it. You know, because an ally is such a passive thing that we really want people to think about being more of co-conspirators. And, you know, I first heard co-conspirators and that kind of terminology through Mia McKenzie, who used to write a blog called Black Girl Dangerous. It's a great book, by the way, that's still for sale, Black Girl Dangerous. But we want you to actually not just show up for us, we want you to stand by us. And sometimes an ally goes further than standing up and speaking up. You're seeing co-conspirators right now in the Black Lives Matter movement. When a group of Black people are at the front of the protest, they will call for the white shield. And the white shield means the white people come in and they stand in front, and there has been much less police violence when there are white people called in to take kind of take that stance, because just traditionally that is what we've seen in protest, is the Black individuals and people of color are the ones who are most harmed at these protests. There's a video that's gone around of a white woman in Green Bay who was yelling and yelling and yelling at a police officer and saying basically, well, you want to shoot me and things like that, standing next to a Black man. The police officers grabbed him and threw him to the ground, and she ran away. And it's just another example of sometimes how white people can get in the way. We're asking for white people to get in the way in the way that we ask you to get in the way. That means to help stop violence and not to take over and take over the mic. And so, you know, people of color, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color don't need you to do anything other than just pass the mic and stop hogging the mic, basically. But remember, an ally term, you know, ally is a term that is most used, we see in LGBTQ work. So I'm going to say ally for now. It also, you know, we want to think about creating inclusive workspaces, and, you know, don't assume people's gender identity or sexual orientation, even if it's let's just say a cisgender woman who comes in with 3 kids. We don't want you assuming that that means she's heterosexual. I have 3 kids, I have grandchildren. You know, when they come in, thank them and show appreciation for their trust. It takes a lot for an LGBTQ person to go to a mainstream provider. I mean, even restaurants, LGBTQ people, we are asking other people, hey, this new restaurant, have you heard? Good experience, bad? Because we don't want to go in and have a bad experience. And so we listen a lot through word of mouth. And your programs know that too. We hear it from survivors all the time. what programs are doing really great, what programs might need some help learning accountability. I think our work in this work is like, if you screw up, we know that that's going to happen. We want to help hold you accountable and hold you in that. It is a really loving thing to hold people accountable. And so we wanted to be here. It's not the most fun thing that we do, but we are here to help hold you accountable. If you get a complaint against you, if you get, you know, somebody who says that you're not treating them well, we have gotten calls, and sometimes we've been able to help the staff understand what that survivor is saying, because we've heard from, you know, programs that say, oh, they're just making it about being trans when it's really about this. Well, you know, or they're just making it about being Black or this or that. And really, when we talk to the survivor and we talk to the staff, it often is because of color. It often is because of their gender identity. So, you know, take their identity at face value, no matter what you think. No matter who you think you're looking at in your mind, our minds put people into genders because that's how we were socialized. Avoid doing that whenever you can. Let them tell you about themselves. Avoid invasive questions or non-compliments. You know, we don't want to be hearing these ridiculous compliments about ourselves because you're trying to like prove you're like, you know, like you're one of the girls or whatever. We really just want to keep it relevant and professional. Have resources on hand that are LGBTQ resources, because what we find in our programs is a lot of the survivors are working with mainstream, and they're also working with us. That's co-collaboration, that's co-advocacy. That's what we hope for the most, is to have that co-advocacy. I will say, in that same survey, when we asked people where they would turn to if they were victims of violence, 84% of those individuals said that they would not go to a mainstream service. They're going to an LGBTQ organization. When you think of the number of LGBTQ anti-violence organizations in the state, that scares me, because there's Diverse and Resilient in Milwaukee, there's the Milwaukee LGBT Center. You know, I know that Outreach in Madison now has some funding, and a lot of our organizations have some LGBTQ advocates in their programs, but not everywhere. And in rural Wisconsin, that's a very scary thing if they don't want to go to a mainstream org. Have resources on hand as well. Sometimes you can show that you're inclusive, but I want to give a notion of caution here. And I can't believe I didn't even put up our survivor stickers, which I should have put up. We actually have stickers that I should have put in this PowerPoint that say, LGBTQ family are welcome here. This is a program that partners with Diverse and Resilience Room to Be Safe program, because we want to make the welcoming message, and we also put our information on there in case they want to reach out to us. But be careful, because if you do a staff training and you have a staff member, which we've heard of, one staff member, one volunteer who says, I don't agree with this because of my religious views, that's their right to have that, but then that is not a safe space for that survivor to come into. You may be a safe person, you may have safe staff, but you really want to consider asking these questions even before you hire people or have them as volunteers, because we've had some pretty damaging things happen from people who are volunteers on hotlines. So as you're training your staff on this webinar will be available. We recommend that you send it to your volunteers as well, so that they can be educated as well. And just using the language, it's critically important, again, that you use the person's chosen name, that they tell you their name, regardless of legal documentation. Can't tell you how frustrated I get, especially with the probation and parole system, who continues to insist not all providers or probation agents do this, but some on a power trip will say, I have to use their legal name, I can't call them any other name. If that is one of your policies, we need to get that changed, and we'll help you to change that, because I cringe when I'm working with survivors who probably should not have been arrested in the first place, and they're dealing with a probation agent now who's calling them by their dead name. And that's just further reason that the person that you're working with is not going to succeed in jobs, not going to succeed in the community, because you're not honoring them with the dignity that they deserve. Their legal name may be on documentation. We ask that you don't share that with other people. Nobody needs to know what their legal name is. Most of you don't know what my middle name is. The DOJ is probably on here. You probably know my middle name, but most of you don't know my middle name. I don't share that with everybody. That's my choice of who I share that with. Use correct pronouns. And how do you find out about a person's pronouns? Are they on your intake form? Ask what pronouns people use. I ask people, I say, I'm Kathy, I use she, her pronouns. What are your pronouns? And I don't say preferred, because honestly, these are pronouns that you should use for them. It's not just, I prefer this, but I guess you can call me another pronoun. Most, you know, your pronouns are your pronouns, and that's how we ask. Whoops. And so, you know, when you're asking about, are you married, just recognize that marriage equality isn't that old in this country, and not all queer people are like down with this heterosexual model of marriage, and a lot of queer people are not getting married specifically because it is so founded in heterosexism and gender stereotypes. I'm married, I love being married, but that's not for every queer person. So ask, you know, about the important people in their life. Do they have a significant other? Are they in a relationship? Do you live with anybody? Tell me about yourself, and be prepared that in straight communities and in LGBT communities, people might be polyamorous, which means they may be in a relationship with more than one person, openly, consensually, with all partners agreeing that they are in a polyamorous relationship, or poly as we would like to sometimes call it. But again, when I talk about these and when I talk about sex, this and hookups and all of that, we are talking about not just the LGBTQ community, but the LGBTQ community is the one who gets the stigma for doing these things. So other information about yourself where it's appropriate. When I'm presenting, I often come out as queer because I know that there's queer young people in the audience who need to hear that the presenter is queer. I come out about my identity just so that I can be seen sometimes when other people feel that they can't. Yes, your bathroom situations. I know that I go into programs, there's 2 bathrooms. I see 1 male and 1 female. Those bathrooms should be gender inclusive of all genders. If you know, especially when you have single stall bathrooms, there's no reason a single stall bathroom should be gendered. Or even bathrooms in general, think of just having gender neutral bathrooms for everybody so that people don't have to like be harassed and bullied in bathrooms that they are. However, you can put on, like we do, we put this bathroom, we put a picture of a toilet and a urinal. So people who are people who have biological ways that they would want to use a urinal, they're going to go and use a urinal. If they just want a toilet, they're going to go in the bathroom that just has a toilet. And so that sometimes tells me where I might want to go. If that one's full, I'm going to go in the one with the urinal, and I may walk by somebody at a urinal, and like I would imagine cisgender men in a urinal, you don't go up and look at what people are doing at a urinal. You go to your stall or go to where you need to go. So gender neutral bathrooms. You can also, you know, create inclusive spaces. Don't be afraid to ask, don't be afraid to make mistakes. When you do, apologize and move on, and don't keep beating yourself up over it. That's just a bad term, but don't keep, you know, harping on it in your head. Sometimes we make mistakes. We all make mistakes. You know, identify other culturally competent colleagues as well, you know, and maybe hold each other mutually accountable. That's part of what we want to do in this work, is hold each other accountable. Wow, we got to the end of that, and it is 20 minutes, it is 18 minutes to noon. So I'm going to see if there are any other questions before I end this with the traditional, I see a lot of thank yous. So I end each presentation with this slide because, you know, I was diagnosed with a number of different things. I have a number of different health issues and disability. And when I saw this in 2007, this tree, it really spoke to me. And normally when I'm in an audience where people can talk back to me, I say, what do you think is really special? But I'm going to ask Nick, because Nick probably knows. What is really special about that tree to me, Nick?
It's growing on a rock.
Yes, yes, thank you. So he has been coached and trained. It is growing out of a rock. And I had this moment, like with everything I was going through, I was like, I'm going to be okay. If this rock can survive, I can survive. And then I came around the boat and I saw this system here. I don't know if you could see it, but there's this large, thick root system that connects to this bigger forest behind. Whoa, bigger forest behind. Okay. This bigger forest behind it, and my screen just messed up. The message then became very clear to me that we are always connected to something bigger. For some people, that is the people in our work, our community. For some people, it's faith. For other people, it's different things. And we just want to let you know that we are part of that community, and we are part of your forest. And so I think we have a couple of questions. No, there's some thank you in the chats. There's a question. Can you share your links for resources for easier access? Yes. For what resources? Yes, but could you maybe, anonymous person, tell me what resources, but we certainly will share that. We're going to share the PowerPoint, and some of the PowerPoint does have links in it, but we will share other resources as well.
And Kathy, one other question that that Nick actually answered in the chat, but it looks like they asked again, so maybe Jake wants to clarify a little bit. Asked about the statistic again of the number of cases that refused assistance from the police.
Yeah, so in our first year of the warm line, there was a smaller number, which was 100. You know, we were able to determine when we looked through that, because I do a report for the National Coalition, 100% of the people on the warm line did not want to work with police. And I asked the question because I was new in the movement. I don't necessarily ask them if they want to work with police now, because I learned my lesson the hard way. Most of them have had negative experience in the past with police. That was the number one reason. Sometimes they just didn't want to work with police, or the violence didn't raise to that level that they wanted to work with police. But we have seen the other thing, we work with sex workers, and honestly, when I work with a sex worker, that is not even a question I'm going to ask them, because every sex worker that I've ever worked with who has been raped, who has been robbed, who has been beaten up, as a result says, we can't go to the police because I'm engaged in sex work. They're going to arrest me. And we know that victims get arrested. You know, they may be under the influence of drugs. They may be under the influence. They may have drug paraphernalia out. Whatever. Victims are human beings that, you know, they feel that they would be harassed by police even more because of their color or their sexual orientation or gender identity. So in that first year, it was 100%. And we're not quite sure where we're at now, but I have yet to work, and I don't know if Nick or Jennifer have, we've worked with some really, really tough cases. Sometimes they come to us through police, where police were involved, but I have yet to work with a survivor who has asked us to get to go to the police department and report. And I don't know if Nick and Jennifer have different experience. I think Nick has worked with somebody who's probably involved with law enforcement. That's typically when it's a crime that involves, you know, breaking of bones or stabbing, which are felonies, and somebody else is called in. But typically, I haven't yet. I don't know if you have, Jennifer.
I haven't. No, we did it. I mean, we, like you said, we have some cases that come because they're just like major news-making cases that come through police. But yeah, I haven't either.
Same. Police have been involved, but the work that we're doing isn't involving police. Yeah.
Any other questions? I'm going to look at the chat. I see a lot of nice thank yous. Thank you. And this has just been really great. We're sorry it went so long. That is average for us. We now know that this presentation is about an hour and 45 minutes.
Right.
So Megan, we thank you. We thank Megan and Peter for hosting this. And I don't know if they want to say any words before you go about how this might be available or anything like that.
Yeah, thank you all so much for presenting. This was such a fantastic presentation. I know I got a lot out of it. It seems like folks are asking about if they can get slides, those kinds of things to re-review after. So it seems like folks seem like they got a lot out of it too, which is awesome. Thanks to everybody for attending. This was one of our more well-attended ones, so that's awesome, especially when it's a topic like this. We're always happy when folks are interested. The recording will be up, Peter, probably within the next couple days.
Yeah, today or tomorrow.
And we'll send PowerPoint slides out as well. I saw Kathy said that she was okay with that.
Yep.
Great.
What I'll do is I'll compress them into a PDF because it is kind of a big packet.
Great. And for folks that were asking about links, anything that's linked in the PowerPoint would work through a PDF. That link will work for you. So if there were specific resources that aren't in the PowerPoint that you were looking for, you can respond to when Peter sends out the follow-up resources, and we'll make sure to get you in touch with Kathy to get those links.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So thank you all. And
Thank
great job,
you.
Jennifer. You rocked it.
Yes, thank you.
That was great.